Okay, 5 people in the house.
Hey, everybody.
20.
Okay, 5 people in the house.
Hey, everybody.
In 2020, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi faces a challenger of her own.
Shahid announced his plans to challenge Pelosi on privacy issues, environmental justice, and the housing crisis.
Not only does he support Medicare
In 2020, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi faces a challenger of her own.
Shahid announced his plans to challenge Pelosi on privacy issues, environmental justice, and the housing crisis.
Not only does he support Medicare for all, but he also wants to cut military spending.
He understands average, everyday people.
We need a representative that really represents San Francisco's values.
Hey everybody, Shahid here. So glad you're with us. Very excited to bring some folks together this evening. I'm really appreciative for everybody joining us for the second in our series of weekly live streams. We're going to be joined a little bit later by special guest Medea Benjamin, someone I've known for a long time through her work at Code Pink, Women for Peace. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Just to give you a preview of some other things we'll talk about in the next little while together. We'll talk a little bit about this morning's news from Bernie Sanders and a call to action for all of us. We'll talk a little bit about the updates from our campaign. We'll have a conversation with Medea, which I'm looking forward to very much. And then we'll have a Q&A. Inviting questions from you all on the various platforms that you're watching on. So just to dive in there, and then we'll hear from my colleague Emily Jones, who will share with us some upcoming events on the campaign and ways that you can get involved. And we need these voices, your voices now more than ever, especially given the news this morning. I think a lot of people have been going through a lot of feelings today. I'm reminded of the scene in Star Wars: A New Hope where Obi-Wan Kenobi is reflecting on the destruction of Alderaan, and he says, I fear something terrible has happened, as if millions of voices have cried out at once. And I felt millions of voices crying this morning. And among the things I'm here to say to you is that we might be down, but our movement is not out, not by a long shot. We can't be. There's too much at stake, and we can't afford to be. I remain very inspired by Bernie Sanders. I'm very grateful for all the work that he's done. I'm grateful for all the work that all of you have done, all the time, and the energy and the blood and the sweat and the tears and the phone calls and the meetings and the emails and the Zoom conferences and the conversations at dinner tables, the pounding the pavement, all that work that we've all done over the last several years around Bernie's campaign. None of that was for naught. And you're right to feel hurt. You're right to feel exhausted. And I'll just share with you a little bit about what it's like for me. You know, I went from our campaign, putting me in a position to help Bernie as our next president, breathe into being a new future. And it went from that, really just in the last 12 hours to I'm auditioning for the chance to fight a would-be tyrant in Washington, whether, whoever wins the next election, frankly. And I'm very eager to see us show up for the future. The future needs us today to stand up, to overcome the system that will deny it a chance to exist if we're unsuccessful. And, we might have lost a battle here in the context of the 2020 presidential primary. And, I don't want to sugarcoat that, but at the same time that we might have lost this battle, there is a war yet to be won. And we've seen our civilization, we have lost battles and gone on to win wars before. The civil rights movement suffered plenty of setbacks. The movement for women's suffrage suffered plenty of setbacks. The peace and justice movement confronting what seemed like an inevitable nuclear conflict between superpowers within my lifetime suffered setbacks, and each of those movements, at least in their eras, were victorious, and we shall be too. I'm really inspired by a great many aspects of the slogan, not me, us. And one of them is that at a time when any of us, whether due to illness or whatever unfortunate set of events, whenever any one of us might not be on the field, the rest of us remain there. The movement is more than just any single voice. And we are a leader-full movement, gratefully. I learned that in the Occupy movement. I've learned it in each of the grassroots movement that we've all built together, the movement for Black Lives and the immigrant rights movement and the peace and justice movement. And all of those movements, we see a proliferation of leaders. And I see that in Bernie's movement as well. In Not Me, Us, I see a nationwide hive of inspired, committed, insightful, energetic, concerned activists and community organizers and just community members, workers, family members, students who are concerned for the future. And our campaign remains here. Every single one of you remains here. The squad remains on the field, and we collectively are tasked with the job of expanding it until we can capture Congress and we can pull in, hopefully, some saner conversations in the future going forward in policy. Going to be pulling in Medea Benjamin shortly from Code Pink. Medea is somebody I've been inspired by for a long time. We first met in 2004 in New York City during the Republican National Convention. We were there both protesting it and organizing with a series of groups, and we were together on an independent radio show. And I just very distinctly have the memory of meeting her because she'd run for Senate, the US Senate in California some years before, and I was aware of her, but hadn't had a chance to meet her yet. And in the years since, I've had the opportunity to perform music at her birthday parties. We've traveled together as parts of large delegations that she's helped organize to both Cuba and to Palestine. I've learned a great deal, particularly from the women across the world, frankly, who I've had a chance to meet through Medea, who've been fighting our military-industrial complex and its continuing mounting intersectional compounding human rights abuses. We'll hear a little bit about her work around both the specific contexts of US foreign policy in Venezuela and also US foreign policy in Iran, as well as the broader theme around the bipartisan commitment in the United States to the Pentagon and the contracting corruption complex that President Eisenhower warned us to fear as he was architecting it. Medea's done a lot of work in a lot of different contexts. We got close in the context of the anti-war organizing challenging Bush in the years that I was first in Washington. And I've seen since then her go on to challenge many of the same abuses under administrations from both political parties. And the bipartisan nature of this institutional corruption is a theme that I hope that we'll have a chance to tease out. And then hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about some actions and campaigns that they might be having, Code Pink coming up, and then we'll come back to our colleague Emily a little bit later on. So with that, let me see if we can pull Medea in. I might ask, see if she's in the studio yet. She might not be, in which case I'll just share a little bit more, some updates from the campaign in the meantime. She'll be with us in just the next few minutes, I think. I had an opportunity recently to do an interview with an independent journalist in New York by the name of Walker Bragman. And it was a fascinating conversation. We talked about a great many things, including the coronavirus pandemic. We talked about how it makes all the more urgent the case for universal health care. We particularly talked about an issue of grave concern to both me and Medea, and that is to say civil liberties and the emergence of expanding authoritarian powers in a time of crisis. You might have heard me last week talk about how Naomi Klein's shock doctrine applied to authoritarian powers playing out under our feet, where the Trump administration, with the help of too many voices in Congress, is grabbing new powers, surveillance powers that he wants to extend even though they've expired as they were previously scheduled to do. So, and also detention powers to override habeas corpus and to potentially detain people without charge or trial within the United States. And that might be one thing under a different president. I would just invite you to consider what it looks like under this administration. We cannot let these powers take root. And that was among the issues I had a chance to talk to Walker about. Interestingly enough, within an hour of the interview concluding, it was taken down from YouTube. And we talked a little bit about that online. I thankfully will have a chance to talk to Walker again tomorrow morning, and I'm looking forward to that. I think Medea is just joining us now. I'm looking forward to that. Another thing I'm looking forward to tomorrow, just to put this on your radar screen, I think Emily will mention this a little bit later on. I'll be on C-SPAN talking with the Commonwealth Club here in San Francisco. I'm very much looking forward to that conversation and a chance to talk about the campaign and the issues with a wider audience. I want to welcome to our live stream my very dear friend, someone I admire very much, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink and Global Exchange. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Medea.
Hey, nice to be on with you, Shahid.
It's great to have you with us, sister. How are you doing in the face of the pandemic first? Let me start there.
Well, knock on wood, I'm not sick, and my loved ones are all okay, but my daughters and grandkids are in New York, so they're all very worried. And I am in Miami, where things aren't great either. So it's tough times, but it's tough times all over the world.
Yes. I all the more appreciate you joining us in that context. And I feel very grateful, especially knowing what some of our neighbors in some of the places you mentioned, particularly New York, are going through right now. So thank you for taking time to join us. I wanted to maybe start in before you joined us. I was telling folks just a little bit about your history of activism and organizing in Code Pink and various settings in which we've had a chance to work together. Do you want to talk a little bit about Venezuela, since that's the current flashpoint, and just catch people up on the news that they might not have heard?
It's pretty amazing that this is happening in our times, Shahid. This is the kind of thing you read about, the gunboat diplomacy, or in quotes, or the straight out coups, the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. imposition of its will is being carried out in Venezuela in the most obscene way at the most perilous of times. So you have the government of Hugo Chavez that came in a long time ago. So it's been about 20 years that the U.S. has wanted to get rid of the government that then, after Chavez died, was turned over to Nicolas Maduro, who was voted in by the people. And the Trump administration has really revved this up to a new level, recognizing a guy who has never been elected to be president by one person in Venezuela, Juan Guaido, and appointing him as president and getting US allies around the world to agree to that. So they've set up this parallel government pretending that there is a guy, Guaido, who has some power, who has absolutely no power inside Venezuela. Meanwhile, the guy who was elected, who is the president, who has the power inside Venezuela, who is recognized by the United Nations, is the one that they have just indicted on drug trafficking charges last week. Totally bogus indictment. If you really want to look for drugs coming to the United States, it would be in neighboring Colombia, where the vast majority of the cocaine comes from.
Or Langley, Virginia, for that.
Or what?
I was suggesting Langley, Virginia, thinking about Gary Webb and the history.
Right. And of course, why don't you go for the consumers here in the United States, or countries like Honduras, where it's been proven that the government has been using drug money for its campaigns. But they've gone after Maduro, and this is on the pretext, trying to set things up like with Noriega from Panama in 1989, where they indicted him and then they invaded the country to get him out. And when they made the indictment, your listeners, with all that's going on here, might not have heard that they also put a $15 million reward for information leading to his capture. So it's really like putting a bounty on his head. This is a sitting president. And then on top of all of that, they have increased the sanctions to a brutal level, where a country that relies on oil for the majority of its revenue is not able to sell its oil overseas. And of course, now the added complication that the price of oil, because of the price wars between Saudi Arabia and Russia, have now tanked. So there is like no money coming in as revenue for the Venezuelan government, and even a shortage of gasoline for Venezuelans. And then on top of that, you have the announcement that the U.S. is sending warships and AWAC planes and thousands of sailors and Marines to the shores of Venezuela, as well as to bases that it has inside neighboring Colombia. Sure. So this is a horrific situation. And I think the president has chosen this time of coronavirus on purpose, because Americans are distracted and the whole world is distracted. Yep. And so he's trying to do what they've been trying unsuccessfully to do for over a year now, which is to overthrow the government of Maduro and put their guy, Juan Guaido, as president.
Never let a good crisis go to waste would be the Cheney-Kissinger doctrine, perhaps, right? And we see it continuing under our feet today. Before we turn to the common denominator between there and Iran, you named it oil. Can you talk to us for a second about the Venezuela embassy actions that you and your colleagues were helping support last year? I'd love for people to hear about that drama that took place within our country in Washington, D.C. around this set of events. I feel like that was a saga that not everybody had a chance to hear about.
No, it was amazing that a lot of the mainstream press just ignored what was an incredible it went on for weeks and weeks, when at the invitation of the Venezuelan government, many of us went to live inside the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C., to stop the US government from handing it over to the representatives of the fake government of Juan Guaido. And we had wanted there to be an agreement between the Venezuela and US governments to say, all right, let's hold off on doing anything with the US embassy in Venezuela and the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. Let's put both of these buildings in the hands of a third party, which is often done when there are these kind of conflicts between countries. And that can be a sort of cooling off situation in which the consulates could continue functioning so that Venezuelans in the US could continue to get their passports updated and other consular services that they needed. But instead, the US government, what they did was started making life extremely difficult for those of us inside by allowing right-wing Venezuelans to surround the building and not let food inside. And in addition to that, the US government, the local government, cut off the electricity and water. So it was really like a siege of the embassy. And we had to evacuate some people because there literally wasn't enough food. The 4 people who stayed behind were finally arrested, and they have been dealing with a court case ever since, which has not yet been settled. But it was actually something that inspired a lot of people around the world who did hear about it, because they were so happy to see that there were Americans who don't want our government to be trying to determine who is in power in another country, that it should be up to the Venezuelan people, not the Trump administration.
Right on. And maybe that's a theme I want to just shout you out to our audience. You know, there is always, I think, in today's a poignant moment to think about it in the context of Bernie's announcement, you know, moments of setbacks. And in those moments, especially to think about the future, to think about the international eyes watching, to continue the work is crucial. And, you know, for you to be doing the work in DC under this administration at this point in time is just so incredibly important. So just thank you for holding that down. A minute ago, you talked about the oil market and the way that that plays into the US interest in Venezuela. And another place that we see that same interest emerge is Iran, where just to set this up for people, right, 1953, the US effectively imposes a brutal autocrat, a dictator, the Shah of Iran, after Iran tried to nationalize its oil fields, taking them back from US and British corporations. And then 30 years later, there was a revolution. And in that revolution, American hostages were taken. Fast forward after that, there's all kinds of saber rattling between many administrations and Iran. And then under President Obama, this historic nuclear treaty. And now we see under President Trump, a rollback of the recent détente and an escalation, the likes of which we haven't seen in that region since Bush invaded Iraq. Do you want to tell folks a little bit about what's happening in Iran today, in our names and with our resources as Americans?
Well, that's a great background you gave, Shahid, and it's why you should be representing the Bay Area in Washington, D.C., because it's so important to understand that history, because that history really colors what is happening today. And the U.S. government has been resentful of the Iranian Revolution ever since it came to power in 1979, which was really part of the continued Iranian opposition to the US imposed Shah. And the sanctions have been on Iran in one form or another for 40 years. But as you said, with the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration negotiated, it was the one foreign policy real achievement of the Obama administration. Trump came in and said, this is a lousy deal, withdrew the United States and reimposed sanctions and made them even worse. And what is so heartbreaking, Shahid, because I've been to Iran several times, I was there after the nuclear deal was signed, and there was such a sense of euphoria inside Iran. People were literally dancing in the streets when the deal was signed. The reformists had the upper hand. They were seen as having done a good job, that the Iranian economy was going to be able to grow, that people were going to have a good relationship with the West. And so when Trump came and reversed all of that, the results have been very devastating for the economy as well as for the psyche of the Iranian people.
And also for the U.S. relationship, just to pin that tail on the donkey. I mean, I hear you saying that there was an opportunity for a healing that has been wrecked.
Right. And the Iranian people really wanted that because they love Americans. They might not like our government's policies, but they certainly love Americans. And now the situation is really dire. We talked about the price of oil plummeting, the fact that the U.S. says they don't want a drop of Iranian oil to be sold overseas. And they have imposed these sanctions that say not only can't U.S. companies trade with Iran, but they don't want any companies in the world to trade with Iran. And it's such an incredibly imperial hubris kind of policy. And the U.S. enforces it because, and gets away with it, because the dollar is so powerful, because it is the international currency, because the U.S. has control over the SWIFT system that the banks use to transfer money from one bank to another, even if it's not a U.S. bank or never goes through the United States. So the European countries have been afraid to be on the wrong side of the U.S. So have Japanese companies, Korean companies. The only ones who have somewhat defied the sanctions are Russian and Chinese. But the U.S. is making the Russians pay for it dearly as well, and has sanctioned the big Russia oil company, Rosneft, for dealing with Iran. And so at a time now with the coronavirus, when the world is saying these sanctions should be lifted, Trump is turning up the screws, not only by finding new areas like in petrochemicals to impose new kinds of sanctions, but also to be attacking Iran inside Iraq. Iraq is the neighboring country to Iran. Iraq is a Shia majority country, just as Iran is a Shia country. The US invasion of Iraq, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, ironically, got rid of a Sunni leader and put the Shia in power, which made Iran have more influence in Iraq than it had before. And the U.S. is blaming any attacks on U.S. soldiers on Iran. Shahid, you know well, but I don't know if your listeners know, that many Iraqis for 16 years now have been trying to get rid of U.S. forces. And in fact, the Iranian parliament voted overwhelmingly to force the U.S. troops to leave. But the Trump administration, even though Donald Trump said he wants to end the endless wars, they said, no way, you can't tell us to leave. And in fact, if you try to push us to leave, we'll sanction you as well. So the tension is very high with the U.S. hitting Iranian allies in Iraq, threatening Iran with military intervention, and really causing a region-wide conflict with its proxy wars. And so this has been a problem all over the region, but it's made life for 80 million people in Iran so difficult. And they have been the hardest hit by the coronavirus. They have been, they're the number one in the entire Middle East. And so this is certainly a terrible time to be turning up the screws on Iran instead of working with them.
And of course, sanctions are always effectively economic warfare directed at a people rather than just policy interventions directed at a government. And before, when you talked about international observers who like Americans and don't like our government's policies, I think that describes a lot of Americans. I know a lot of Americans who love the American people and share that, frankly, very appropriate, not just concern about our policy. And I want to turn the lens here, not just concern, but maybe outrage, particularly because whether it's Iran in 1953 or Panama in 1991 or Nicaragua in the years before that, in all these different theaters, across all the dozens of interventions by the Pentagon and our various agencies, the essential ingredient, the recurring element, is our military-industrial complex and the interest in the United States, not just of the Pentagon, but also the weapons contractors and the various industries and surrounding enterprises, each of the federal departments. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the military-industrial complex in Washington, D.C. under both parties? Is it the case that as Americans, we have opportunities at the ballot box to repudiate that? To what extent are Democrats also, unfortunately, complicit in this serial corruption?
Well, if you look at the cases that we were just talking about, the Democrats, even though Obama had negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, they've done very little to try to overturn what the Trump administration is doing. I must say Bernie Sanders has been an exception. He has been leading the way to a better foreign policy when it comes to U.S. support for the Saudis and the devastating war in Yemen, as well as in the case of Iran, less so when it comes to Venezuela. And certainly there are some Democrats like Ilhan Omar and other members of the, quote, squad who have been good, and some other members of the Progressive Caucus. But to a large extent, the Democrats have done almost nothing. And this is true of Nancy Pelosi in the leadership position, when she has so much power and could do so much. So it is very unfortunate that the mainstream of the Democratic Party, as well as just about the entire Republican Party, with a few exceptions, like Rand Paul, who is good on some of these foreign policy issues, some other conservative Republicans like Mike Lee from Utah have been good on this. But for the most part, the entire Republican Party has been horrific. And yes, it's very much related to both their worldview that the US has the right to dictate who should be in control of other countries. And Donald Trump is just a little more explicit about it than Democratic presidents have been. He says now we're in Syria to make sure that we are watching over the oil. And he says the same thing now in the case of Iraq. But yet it is part of the military-industrial complex, the massive amount of money that our elected officials allocate to the Pentagon year after year, and the revolving door between the Pentagon, these weapons companies themselves, the lobbyists, and the U.S. elected officials. You just see it go round and round and round. And the money is laundered from the taxpayers, always coming from us, to the hands of the electoral campaigns of the candidates, especially those who are on the armed services committees and the foreign affairs committees. And then the money that goes to the Pentagon, so much of that goes in contracts to Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and then those companies just give a little of it back to the politicians, and also make sure that they produce different parts of their war machines in districts all over the country, so that it's not just an issue of giving money to the campaigns, but also becomes an issue of jobs, jobs, jobs. And that helps to keep the cycle going.
Thank you so much for laying out particularly the way in which the military-industrial complex has to some extent co-opted parts of the labor movement. And you also referenced the role of policymakers in this sordid dynamic of the revolving door between the Pentagon and industry. And of course, Eisenhower's first draft of his speech, where he coined the term the military-industrial complex, he originally described it as a military-industrial congressional complex. And I think you mentioned Speaker Pelosi, and just a few minutes ago, Juan Guaido, it was maybe just a month ago, right, that she stood next to him at a podium in Washington, welcoming the beneficiary of a U.S. coup to Washington at the same time that during the middle of a pandemic, right, we're escalating military tensions with that country. So just now we were talking about the way that military contracting machine sucks all of the air out of the federal budget, or let's just say sucks all the food and the housing and the medicine out of the federal budget. Can you talk for a minute about the other side of the domestic impact in terms of civil liberties, one of the areas where you and I have obviously had the chance to do a lot of work together is around challenging government surveillance within the United States. And I'm fond of talking about how that intersects other areas that people don't think about, like local policing and immigration enforcement. Do you want to talk a little bit about what in the domestic civil liberties arena maybe is concerning you most at the moment?
Well, this is the area where you are definitely the expert, but I am very worried about the measures that are being taken both here and in other countries around the coronavirus that seem to be helpful in stopping the virus for the moment. Extreme measures that were taken in China of being able to track the phones of people who are infected as well as people who aren't infected to tell them when somebody who is infected is near them. These kind of applications are being used in Israel. They're being used in countries in Europe as well. And it's being talked about. I don't know how much they're actually doing it here behind our backs, but it's being talked about openly as well. And it is during these times of crisis, as we know from the Patriot Act after 9/11, that these kinds of measures are snuck in and people are either unaware of them or willing to give them up in the moment, and then they become part of the fabric of our society.
I talk a lot about in those contexts, whether it's surveillance powers or detention powers, which Trump is also trying to expand at the moment, the need for oversight, transparency, checks, balances for surveillance, data retention limits, use parameters, dissemination limits. There's so many parameters that we can use. Even if we accept the necessity for some measure, there are parameters we can impose to ensure legitimacy and make sure that there don't become black holes into which our rights disappear. And I think there's rarely been a time when that's been more important.
Well, I think if you were in Congress, you would be the leader on this because you know more than just about anybody I know about these issues. And we really don't have the kind of champions in Congress we need on these issues. So given how important that particular issue is in these dangerous times, it would be wonderful to have somebody with your expertise and concern about this representing us.
Thank you, sister. That means a lot to me coming from you. And I will say that as an immigrant and a Muslim, my concern around these issues isn't one I necessarily have the liberty of choosing, but I have had entirely too long looking at these issues very closely and having a chance to fight them up close. And I'm eager to escalate that fight in Washington against this criminal administration. Do you want to talk a little bit about any campaigns that you all have happening underway at Code Pink that people can plug into, support? Any events coming up or anything online or otherwise that you might be able to shout out and talk about?
Sure. We are, like a lot of groups, using this time to really educate people. We're doing webinars just about every day with people from around the world that have been really enlightening. So if you go to our website, codepink.org, you can find out about those. We have campaigns on all of these different issues. We're working with broad coalitions around Iran to try to get our congressional officials to speak up, to introduce legislation saying that the US does not have the right to invade Iran. We're trying to get them to speak out about Venezuela as well. We have campaigns about Cuba, trying to stop the US from doing a horrendous campaign they have of maligning the doctors that are going overseas and trying to convince other countries that they shouldn't accept Cuban doctors. So we're trying to educate people around that and stop that campaign. We're working on a long-term campaign to divest from the war machine, in which we're working with cities, including the city of San Francisco, cities around the country, pension funds, just like the people trying to get us out of fossil fuels or the private prison industry, working together with many of them to divest from the weapons industry. And we have campaigns on Palestine, on the issue of Gaza, which is, if people here are feeling very claustrophobic in the lockdown in their homes, we say, look at the people of Gaza who live like that on a day-to-day basis. We're working to try to keep the ceasefire that's just been announced tonight around Yemen, to keep that in place and stop the US from selling weapons to Saudi Arabia as part of a new campaign, which is to boycott Saudi Arabia. It's a very exciting campaign. There are lots of new developments there in which the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, the murderer himself, is trying to portray himself as a reformer and is now the host of the G20 meeting that's supposed to happen in November. So we're trying to get countries to boycott that. So we have a lot of different things going on. And if you're interested, you can go to codepink.org, sign up for our weekly alerts.
Thank you so much for all the different theaters in which you're working. I'm so amazed, frankly, that you're able to cover as much ground as you do. It's really remarkable. We'll be coming up to a Q&A in just a minute. I think folks are going to be collecting some questions for us. Maybe one last question here. You mentioned Cuba and the U.S. campaign there to dissuade other countries from accepting Cuban medicine. You know, for me as a U.S. citizen traveling there with you, my first time in 2015, one of the things that really blew my mind was just learning more about the role that medicine plays in Cuban diplomacy and the idea that what we do with weapons, they do with doctors. Can you talk a little bit about medicine, particularly education in Cuba, and some of the things we learned about how doctors are trained there very differently than they are here, with a different set of objectives and with an eye particularly toward public health?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a couple of different things. One is the healthcare system in Cuba itself, in which it's based on preventive medicine, and where they have family doctors in every single neighborhood that knows the needs, the problems of the different families. And then there is the remarkable program that Cuba has done to send doctors overseas that's been going on for decades, but has it really in the last decade been become a major, in fact, the major source of revenue for Cuba. So imagine a small, poor island in the Caribbean that doesn't want to be totally dependent on tourism, that doesn't want to be totally dependent on remittances from Cuban Americans or Cubans living overseas, that wants to have a source of income that's actually good for the world. Well, they found one, and that was doctors. And we're sending tens of thousands of doctors all over the world. In some countries where they couldn't afford it, Cuba didn't charge. But where countries could afford it, they did charge. And sometimes the United Nations or other international bodies would pay for it. And the Cuban doctor would get a portion of that, but the majority would go towards funding the Cuban education system and the healthcare system. Well, the United States has called that human trafficking. It's amazing how they have distorted this. And they've introduced bills against human trafficking, and they've been pushing countries to expel the Cuban doctors. They were successful, for example, in Brazil, when the Workers' Party was basically overthrown in a soft coup, and the Bolsonaro government came in. One of the first things he did was expel the thousands of Cuban doctors there. And now with coronavirus, he's trying to get those doctors back in. So it's really a remarkable program where Cuba is doing a heroic job sending doctors not only in this time of coronavirus, but even before, to areas where people have never seen a doctor before. And instead of applauding that program, working with the Cubans on that program, the US has not only been trying to sabotage it through legislation, but also by setting up places where around the world where Cuban doctors are being enticed to defect. And then if they do, they're given green cards in the United States. They're set up here, at least they're told they're set up here in the United States to practice. And we also have millions of US dollars flowing through AID that are going to entice people to find stories that are negative stories about this program. So our tax dollars are even being used to try to malign what is one of the most beautiful programs that a poor country has ever come up with, in which they get revenue by helping poor people around the world.
As an immigrant, I'm very concerned about the legacy of our country abroad and the way we show up on the international stage. So it's another thing I was grateful for the chance to learn more about that on that trip that you organized. I want to invite our listeners to post questions. If you're listening on Twitter or Facebook or Twitch, feel free to write any questions that you'd want us to address. A couple that my colleagues have flagged here. One, how can somebody at home best support global peace efforts during this crisis, particularly given the pandemic and how it shifts the opportunities that are available to us? How do you have ideas, thoughts, things you might have seen at Code Pink and otherwise that case studies, ideas for people to pursue?
Well, it's very exciting now, actually, that the Secretary General of the United Nations has called for a global ceasefire. And it's not just a statement that he put out. He's really trying to put the muscle of the UN behind this. He's sending his envoys to the places in conflict to try to find a way to say, in light of this humanitarian crisis, how are we going to push all sides to the table? The fact that there is a ceasefire that the Saudis agreed to tonight is precisely because of the push right now. So one of the things he has called for is for citizens around the world to sign up on to this. And there's been over 1 million people who have signed on to various petitions supporting the Secretary General's call. We have one on our site at Code Pink. We also have related it to Easter coming up because the Pope has put out echoing the call of the Secretary General. So go online and you can sign up to that petition. But there's also other ways that we send out in our weekly emails that give people a chance. For example, tomorrow we have a Twitter storm that we're doing with people around the world that is saying we want diplomacy, not sanctions, not war. And it's exciting to see the kind of momentum that exists now, not only for a ceasefire, but for lifting of these sanctions. I was laughing because the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, who is known for having supported the brutal sanctions against Iraq that led to the death of 500,000 children, came out officially calling for these sanctions to be eased during this time of coronavirus. So things are moving even among those who have been so bad on this issue in the past.
I'm glad to see that, and it's exciting to see hope spring eternal even in these dark times. You talked about the motion on Yemen this evening. There's opportunities for progress even in moments when we might not necessarily see it. The last questioner also had.
I want to just add one more thing on the Yemen front that people can do. That in the meantime, the U.S. has cut the aid that it was giving to Yemen, which is a pittance compared to all the weapons money that we're getting to bomb Yemenis. But one of the campaigns is to restore the money going to Yemen and to increase it.
And then just to flip the other side of that table, obviously, it's the Saudi genocide happening with U.S. support. The last questioner who'd asked about what we can do to support global peace apparently had a particular question about Saudi Arabia. Do you want to talk about, just to dive in there around, you'd mentioned some of the latest from within the kingdom. Do you have any particular campaigns that are facing the Saudi regime? I know it's one in which we've shared concerns for a long time.
Yeah, we've actually been amazingly successful in Congress. One of the very few bipartisan pieces of legislation around foreign policy has been to stop the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And that passed twice, and it was vetoed by Trump. But we continue to push those efforts inside of Congress and continue to find other ways, like this boycott campaign that I talked about, that is meant to be a kind of similar to the divestment campaign around Israel, to be pressuring the Saudis on their human rights abuses. We also have a specific campaign trying to get released the Saudi women activists who at the very time when the Crown Prince announced that Saudi women would be allowed, like women all over the rest of the world, to drive, he threw the women who had been fighting for that in prison, where some of them still remain. So we have a campaign to try to get those women released from prison. So these are some of the things, but most important really is to try to find ways to stop the US from continuing its weapon sales to the Saudis.
You certainly gather no moss. It's amazing the number of fronts that you managed to cover. One of our questioners had asked about your start in activism. What got you? What was your start in activism like? Who were your inspirations? Is there a story you want to tell that some of our listeners might find an accessible way, a ramp for themselves into activism?
Well, I'm of the Vietnam generation, so my aha moment was a very horrific one in which my sister's boyfriend was sent off to Vietnam in the draft and started writing letters home that got weirder and weirder. He was a really nice, healthy, all-American kind of guy until one day he sent her the ear of a Viet Cong to wear as a necklace. And I was so disgusted by it. I went to the bathroom and threw up and started an anti-war group in my high school. So my origins were really from that horrific war in Vietnam. And I've never given up on trying to make my country one that is accountable and to stop committing these kinds of horrific wars or economic policies overseas that take away the lives and the livelihoods of people around the world.
That lifelong commitment, I'm certainly inspired by it. I think a lot of other people have been inspired by it. I hope some people listening and watching here today are inspired by it and inspired to join you in those actions. I want to just invite, before we wrap up, any reflections that you might share in the wake of today's news from Senator Sanders. We talked a little bit about it before you came on. My attitude is sort of, we're down as a movement, but we're not out. And we're not only all here to struggle for another day, but that other day really needs us to stay active and to stay focused and to flip each of the seats that we can and to continue fighting for the Green New Deal and public ownership of key sectors. Do you want to talk a little bit about any feelings or thoughts you might want to share?
Yes, everything you've just said. And honestly, I feel that this has been an incredible movement that has moved the country and the Democratic Party to the left in a way that I have not seen in recent decades. And to now be talking seriously about Green New Deals and Medicare for All and decarceration and reparations and taking on issues of what is a living wage and issues around childcare and all of these incredibly important issues. I think less so on the foreign policy front. I wish that had been a bigger part of Bernie's campaign. Although, as I said, he was our champion when it came to things like trying to stop U.S. support for Saudi Arabia. But in general, these campaigns were not focused enough on foreign policy issues. So I think it means that while we have moved very much to left on a lot of domestic issues, we still have that huge Pentagon budget that we have to start really getting serious about. How are we going to cut into that in a way that would free up hundreds of billions of dollars to use for things like free college education, Green New Deal, healthcare for all, the kind of things that help people instead of hurting them.
Yes. I'm so grateful for you joining us tonight. I want to, and for all your work and the inspiration and support you've offered me, your endorsement in this race, for instance. Keep in touch, stay connected, send us any links you want us to share. I'll be very eager to amplify them and share them with people going forward. And I know I'm joined by a great many people in thanking you for your leadership and your representation and your writing and your organizing and your speaking truth to power. Don't stop. Thank you, sister.
Okay, great talking to you. Good luck on the campaign trail. Much love.
Thank you, Medea. Much love to you too.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too. So in a minute, we'll be joined by my colleague, Emily Jones, who's going to round out our live stream with some updates for going forward. A couple just to, I think and for the moment while we're waiting, next week we'll be joined on this live stream, same time, same place, by Linda Sarsour in New York City, who I can't wait to have a chance to reconnect with. She's just dropped a new book. I'm really excited to hear about it. We've got a few exciting things in the meantime. I mentioned this just very briefly earlier. Actually, Emily's here, and I'll turn to her to bring us home. Thanks again for joining us today from me. Emily?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying with us till now. Just to give an update on what we talked about last time, we are working very hard. The campaign staff is working really hard because in addition to everything we are talking about, we are all dealing with this pandemic. So the team is checking on San Franciscans. Last week, we reached 400 people, and this week we reached 600 more. And we are still looking for volunteers. So please email info@shahidforchange.us, or you can go to our website and click on the volunteer button. We want more people to reach out to San Franciscans, offer help, check how they're doing. We have a good resource list, and it feels good for all of us. That's the first thing we need volunteers for. We are also facing an uphill battle in this race. So we need all kinds of help from volunteers. We need help with phone banking. We need help with text banking. We are hiring 10 paid new staff this week. So as I said, we are super busy. Every week you'll get an update. We have a live weekly stream. It's a live channel. It's going to be Wednesday, 5 p.m. Next week, look forward to meeting Linda Sarsour. As you know, she is a great activist and friend of Shahid's. Tomorrow, you can watch Shahid on C-SPAN at noon Pacific. Tomorrow, the 9th, it's organized by the Commonwealth Club. So that is going to be super interesting. Shahid did a live interview on YouTube yesterday with Walker Bragman. He's a progressive talk show host. And by algorithm or avarice, YouTube pulled down that video. And we're not too happy about that. So it's going to be a new interview tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific. If you go to Walker Bragman on YouTube, you can watch it 11 a.m. to 11:30. And to wrap up, we just want to name some staff members who have brought us here. And the first, of course, is our wonderful campaign manager, Jasper Wild. Derek Liu, he is our technical director, and he has organized the technology for this live stream. Otto Pippinger is our field organizer and volunteer manager. We have Patrick Cochran. We have Jessica Matthews, who just joined our team, so we welcome her. And a very special thanks to these people. One, the Worker Agency, who are our PR agency. We have Frank Yuan Chen, Sasha Perigo, and Sierra, who many of you have met. Thank you so much for your time, and see you next Wednesday at 5 p.m.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. If you're interested in one of the positions that Emily mentioned, email us at jobs@shahidforchange.us. We'd love to check out your resume and your interests. We have a lot of ground to cover. We're looking forward to doing it together. Again, you might feel down today. It's an okay day for that, but we're not out by a long shot. We have a lot of ground to cover. I'm so grateful for all the support of our incredible campaign team, our vast army of volunteers, and our array of donors around the country. For each of you for tuning in this evening, I look forward to next week. We'll be joined then by Linda Sarsour. Good luck with all of your activism and your organizing. In the meantime, we'll see you online.
Nations hate each other. Political parties hate each other. Classes hate each other. You just go on looking and you will be surprised how many sources of hate are there. And every 10 years, 12 years, and you need a world war. Love is your intrinsic quality. You are born with it. Just as hate is there. I will teach you be aware before anything. Then keep the thread of awareness running through all your actions. And in your life you will not find any hate, any anger, any jealousy.
Bye.